A show of unity. While these two men are on opposite sides of the political spectrum in Iran, what comes next for the president-elect Ebrahim Raisi is the exact same procedure President Hassan Rouhani has gone through twice. First, the results of the election have to be approved by this body, known as the Guardian Council. It is made up of 12 men who are legal and Islamic experts. They will certify the results within a week after the Interior Ministry announces the winner. And about a month after Election Day, an endorsement ceremony by the Supreme Leader confirms the new president. Then, within days of that, the new president makes his way to Parliament for another inauguration ceremony, which is presided over by the head of the judiciary. Following that, President-elect Raisi has 2 weeks to introduce his new cabinet to Parliament, who votes on each of the 19 positions in the new government. Once the majority of the 290-member Parliament votes in favor of a candidate, then the person is officially a minister. But there are 3 high-profile cabinet posts which need the final approval from Iran's highest authority. Those include the foreign minister, intelligence minister, and the defense minister posts. The logic behind that is because the position of the supreme leader is that of the head of the country. He needs to be directly involved in choosing those ministers whom he will be dealing with alongside the president.
The basic convention is that the supreme leader deals with foreign policy issues. He also deals with all security issues in the country, and in turn deals with the defense minister, since he is the commander-in-chief of the country's armed forces. So that's why the supreme leader has a say in who fills those portfolios in government.
Iran's 8th president has a big job ahead of him. The economy is struggling after years of devastating U.S. sanctions. And indirect talks on the 2015 nuclear deal are still happening in Vienna in the hopes of reviving the agreement and lifting sanctions. But the Chief Justice is coming into office at a time when all levels of government are run by conservatives, which will likely make his job easier than any of his predecessors, including picking his cabinet. Ebrahim Raisi will have to choose 19 people to form his cabinet 2 weeks after his confirmation ceremony by the supreme leader. It is possible for the president-elect to appoint those candidates who dropped out of the race and endorsed him into his cabinet. And this time around, Raisi will most likely reward Saeed Jalili and Ali Reza Zaghani for their support during the election. Dorsa, Jabbari, Al Jazeera, Tehran.
Well, Israel's new prime minister's wasted no time condemning Raisi's election win. Naftali Bennett says it should serve as a red flag for world powers who are working to revive that nuclear deal.
Raisi's selection is, I would say, the last chance for the world powers to wake up before returning to the nuclear agreement and to understand who they're doing business with. These guys are murderers, mass murderers. A regime of brutal hangmen must never be allowed to have weapons of mass destruction that will enable it to not kill thousands but millions.
More on this story now with Harry Fawcett in West Jerusalem. And Harry, what struck me there is that at those cabinet meetings, certainly when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in power, you're used to hearing him speak in Hebrew addressing his cabinet. This was in English, and I'm wondering if that was a very purposeful decision.
I think it must have been, yes. I mean, Naftali Bennett's mother tongue is also is English. I mean, he's the son of American migrants to Israel, and his English is probably not quite as good as Benjamin Netanyahu's even. But yes, he decided to make these comments in English because he wanted them to be heard far and wide to a cabinet that would be overwhelmingly expecting to hear him speak in Hebrew. So yes, this is a very deliberate message about the new government's position on the Iran nuclear deal, but also on Naftali Bennett's own personal credentials when it comes to this, because, of course, he is being attacked from the right for being part of a government which extends to the far left in Israeli politics. Benjamin Netanyahu, on his way out of the door last week, was talking about him not being able to stand up to Iran on the nuclear issue, not being able to stand up to Joe Biden and his administration on the Iran nuclear deal. So he has his own political considerations to think about as well. And there are reports as well in the Israeli media that this election could potentially give some kind of operating space for Israel to try to change the position, even to some extent, if not entirely, of the Biden administration, that there might be a pause in negotiations, and this is the time to try to start pressuring the US administration to get it closer, at least, to Israel's very hardline point of view, Naftali Bennett's very hardline point of view against any re-entry to the JCPOA.
Speaking of the US, we've got the head of the Israeli army heading there to Washington. And then the defence minister was there not long ago. I think the president's heading as well. What's going on at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there is a great deal of diplomacy, especially on the military front, especially on the Iran front, between Israel and the US at the moment. To some extent, the timing of this particular visit isn't entirely deliberate. There have been attempts to have this visit several times in recent weeks, and it's been delayed for numerous reasons. This time he is going, Aviv Kochavi. He's meeting the US Defense Secretary, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Advisor, also the head of CENTCOM. And there is some reporting here in Israel suggesting that that is an attempt to try to, because Israel is now classed as part of the CENTCOM operations branch within the US military, i.e. the Middle East branch, that there will be attempts to try to work more closely with some of the Arab nations with whom Israel has started normalization in recent months. And so there is that, but overwhelmingly there is the issue of Iran. Kochavi himself is very hardline on this issue. He got out ahead of Benjamin Netanyahu's own language earlier this year in speaking against the JCPOA, speaking against the Biden administration's incoming signals as to how it wanted to deal with it. So he will be arguing that point very hard. And just this very day as well, his term has been extended by an extra year, not uncommon for Israeli chiefs of staff, but his term will now expire at the beginning of 2023.
Thank you, Harry Fawcett, for all of that from West Jerusalem.